this wouldn't be a classic spaceship shooter game without, of course, the shooty bits. So I'm going to come in here and add a new FSM, and I'm going to call this one shoot. Okay, and I'm going to hit edit. So we're editing the shoot FSM now. And in here, I'm going to get a get button down. Okay, and this one's going to be looking for fire 2. So fire 2, if I come up to our edit project settings, fire 2 is mouse 1, which is also to say right click. Okay, so, or you could use left alt. Here's where you'd be able to change those values if you wanted something else for your game. Okay, but otherwise we're going to use this, and we can send the custom event next, right? We already put that in before, so we can add that transition. And I'm going to come down here. By the way, when you are dragging out a transition like this, you click the actual transition box. When you have the arrow here, if you're holding Control or Command on a Mac, when you let go of your mouse button, it'll automatically create a state to it, right? If I'm not holding Control or Command, it'll just not go to anything. You can also, of course, just add a state and then drag it to that state. All right. So let's say that we have this first state where we're not shooting, and then this state we say shoot. Okay, now in here, what we'll do is we want to do a couple things. We're going to create the object. Okay, we're going to create the bullet object, and then once we created it, we're going to add relative force to it. So we create the bullet, and then we say add force on it so it can actually go towards something. And then when that's done, it'll send back to the next state. But what we want to do is put in a little wait so the player can't spam that, right? So they actually have to wait a second, or else they're going to be able to shoot an infinite amount. And we'll just say that the wait time is like half a second or whatever. And then I'll add a finish transition to this. So if you hold Control or Command on a Mac and click on a state, it'll add this finish transition. And what a finish transition is, it's a special transition. So ours, the one we actually typed in next, it needs an event to explicitly send it off, right? When this send event next happens because we pressed our button down, that explicitly told this next transition to fire off. Because there's nothing special about the events that we create, right? The ones that we type in here and everything. But the thing about a finished transition is that it comes with a little extra coding. It's something that's actually baked into Playmaker. And with finished, it waits for everything in its state to complete until they're finished, and then it fires off. So it doesn't, we could put a little finished event right here, and we could say that it's actually finished, and then it will explicitly fire it off at that point. But you can also leave this as none, and as long as none of these things are running every frame, then this finished transition will recognize that everything completed its job here at, eventually at some point, and then we can use it to send back over here. Okay. The only times this won't work is if something was running every frame. So for example, if I had it like that, if this add relative force was running every frame, that means that this never got to finish because it just keeps doing what it's doing since it's running every frame. And then this finish transition would never send back here. So it would always be waiting, but this is really holding up the line here. So we're not doing that in this situation, and that's why we can use this finish transition. That's why this is a nice little package. This is a nice little setup for us. The object that we're going to be creating here is going to be a bullet, but we haven't made that yet. So I'm going to come over to our project, and then I'm going to take this little vector bullet image that I have here. You could take whatever your bullet image is, and you could drag it into the scene. Okay, and if I focus in on it really quick, right, it's right there, that little circle. Now what I could do is turn it into a prefab. A prefab is an asset that we can use over and over again in our game. That will keep all the programming and designy bits that we've done to it. So for example, our spaceship here, it's not a prefab yet. We'll turn it into one later, but it has all this programming and stuff on it, right? But if we ever destroy it during the gameplay, what happens if we want to make a new one? Like, how do we do that? Well, or what if we wanted to make a bunch of them, right? So for our vector bullet here, this will be a nice little intro into what a prefab is, because essentially all you have to do is first make a folder for it. So we'll go to our assets, and I'm going to right click in here and create new folder, and we're going to call this 03_prefabs. I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to drag and drop our bullet in here. Okay, and you'll see that immediately it turns our little bullet into this blue color. It turned the little game object cube into a solid blue, and it changed the text of it also to blue. And that's Unity's way of showing us that this is a prefab. And indeed, you can see that when we select it over here, it says that it's a prefab. And now that when you see it in here in this folder, it's an asset that we have control over. It's an asset that we can design. So when I select it, it tells you its name down here too, vectorbullet.prefab. And so the things about prefabs, so they're like these templates. They're reusable. They're a way of making things once that you're going to be using over and over again, or having like lots of at the same time. So for example, in a lot of games, that's like coins you pick up, or NPCs like enemies that you're running into, or items that you use over and over again, like potions or whatever, what have you. In our case, it's a bullet, because you're going to be shooting lots of these bullets, and we want to make a bunch of them. But we only need to really design this once, and then we could say to duplicate it over and over again. So I'm actually going to remove it from our hierarchy here. We don't need it in our scene, because now we have it as an asset that we can use. So to program it, you go over to your prefab and you double click on it. Now you'll see that over here, our hierarchy is changed, right? Our hierarchy doesn't show our spaceship anymore. You can even see in our scene, our spaceship is gone, and none of the stuff we were working on, our camera, our light, all that stuff is gone. And that's because we are inside of the prefab now. And that's what this is here. Our vector bullet is like right here. And you can see that there's our little sprite for it and everything. To go back to our scene, you can hit this little back arrow, and that takes us back to our spaceship game scene. Okay, so you can see that our bullet is not here. So when you're editing a prefab, when you're actually designing it to be used in your game, you go to the asset, because it is an asset, you double click on it, and now we can do stuff to it. So with our vector bullet selected, I'm going to add a component to it. We're going to put in a circle collider 2D. Okay, and I do want to turn on my gizmos so we can see it. It's a little big for that, so I'm actually going to shrink it. I'm going to hit this little, I'm going to change this radius. I'm going to shrink it down to, let's say, 0.1. Okay, that's a fair size. So that little green line right there is the actual edge that things have to touch for them to say that they've been hit by the bullet. Okay, so that's our collider on it. And then I'm going to add a FSM. We'll just call this our bullet. And if I hit edit, we can edit this bullet FSM. And the first thing I want to do, let's just do this really quick. Let's put in a screen wrap. Okay, that looks pretty good. And we'll give this a rigid body component so it can actually fly through space. Rigid body 2D. I'm going to change this collision detection from discrete to continuous. And all that's really doing is it's saying that the calculations for this little green circle to check whether or not something has touched it will be happening more often. And the reason we want that is when you have a lot of little things checking whether or not they're touching each other that are moving very fast in games, sometimes in that one instant where they are not checking is also the instant that they end up passing through something. And so it's an optimization thing, so we don't totally fry all of our computers by running a bunch of unnecessary calculations. Because if this was moving nice and slow, you wouldn't really need to have this. But we know our bullets are going to be moving kind of fast. So this is just a way of making sure that our bullet never actually passes through something when it should have hit it. Okay, so changing that from discrete to continuous is just a more surefire way for this to do what it needs to do. And since this is just, this is a classic game that doesn't require a lot of computational power, running continuously is totally fine. And it'll still be very performant even with tons of these on screen. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Let's give this a test now by coming back to our spaceship. Okay, and in here where we create object, what I'm going to do is select this little dot and go to assets and then select our vector bullet. Okay. And so now it's creating this vector bullet. It's creating an instance of it. And then that instance that it creates, and when I say instance, I mean like a clone of it. We need a reference to the clone that it just made. So we'll say that that's a new variable, and we'll call this bullet. And then we're going to add force to that clone of the bullet that it just made. So we're going to specify our bullet. And we're going to add this force to that clone, to that instance on the y-axis. We'll just say that it's 10. All right, and that's all we need. Okay, so if we give this a little spin really quick, press play. All right, so we can move around. And if I right click, well, that's actually kind of funny. So right now what's happening is there's still gravity being applied to these, and they're going to totally wreck me right now. Oh, that's so good. That's so funny. And each time they pass through the screen, I mean, I'm sure you've played Portal, right? Where it's like every time it passes through this, it's gaining more and more momentum. So it's like, oh my god, yeah, it's speeding up so much. My spaceship doesn't stand a chance here. And you can see as I add more of these, that is so funny. Okay, so anyways, what we need to change is we go to our project and we go to this vector bullet, selecting it, and we go over here. The gravity scale, we need to change to 0. Okay, and to prevent it from just spawning in the middle of the screen, on our chute here, the spawn point, we want to create a point for it to actually pop up at, and it should always be in front of the ship. So on our spaceship here, we have our flame down here, right? But if we also right-click and add a new empty object, and we'll call this our cannon, we could drag our cannon right in front of the spaceship like that. So it'll always shoot right out in front. So from our shoot FSM, we could say that the spawn point for these bullets is this cannon. And by the way, the force that we're going to add to this, instead of it just being, we could change this force mode from force to impulse. Because like I said before, remember when I was telling you about this every frame, if we just ran this once, the force it adds is tiny and insignificant because it only does that thing once. With impulse, it'll immediately change the velocity of the bullet. So that's what we want, instead of it having to run every frame and build up all of that force to change the velocity over time. Impulse will give it to us instantaneously. Okay, so we have this vector bullet that's firing from our cannon, which is in front of the spaceship all the time, and we're using this impulse. Okay, so we're looking pretty good now. This should work. So if we fly around and then we can shoot, right, and that's looking pretty good, right, and it shoots always in the direction that we're facing. Okay, and they can even crash, we can even shoot ourselves right now. Okay, and we're bumping into our own bullets and everything. So what we want to do is make a few changes to our bullet. So now we can go to our bullet in here, double click on it, and with it selected in our Playmaker editor, we could change a few things. Some of the things that I can already see that we need is we need the bullet to disappear over time, right? So it should go away after a while. And it should also change when we hit something. So the first thing is, call this first one spawned, right? So it's in the world, it's doing its thing. And then we'll put in a wait action here. And we'll say that this is a new variable called the lifetime of the bullet. And when that's finished, it'll send an event called next. Okay, so we'll send that, and it'll go here to this next state where it will destroy self. Okay, so the bullet will just go away, and we sure enough have a action called destroy self that we could just put in here. Okay, now the reason I didn't just put in a destroy self over here with the timer on it is because we also want another state to send to this destroy self as well. So instead of making a couple of destroy self states, we're only making one that our spawned one can go to, but also another state that we can create over here that will also send to destroy self, which is hit object. Okay, so this is when the bullet actually hits something. Now, a really simple way to put in some logic for things that have collisions is by just adding events to them. So I can right click on this and go to add global transition, system events, collision enter 2D. So this is a transition here, right? This next transition being sent off by this next event. And this up here, actually, this black bar with an arrow coming out of it is also a transition, but this is a global one. So the way that you can remember this is that both of these transition types will always show you that they're a transition because an arrow is coming out of them. This one has an arrow coming out of the side, and it's always attached to the bottom of a state. So this one has to be in a state, right? Local transitions like this need to come with a state. There's no way that this can just be floating out in the middle of nowhere. But a global transition can be floating out in the middle of nowhere. Look, it doesn't come from any state. It is not attached to anything. There's nothing up here. It actually sends to a state. So local transitions require coming from a state, like this one's coming from the spawned state, and global transitions don't require that. But they do, however, require sending to a state. So they're kind of the opposites of each other. And the thing about this is that this requires logic to get there, and this one can kind of happen from anywhere. So if you imagine like, a flow chart, you always have a flow chart that says I need to go from here to here to here to here, right? And it's like, I can't skip state 2 here. This cannot get directly to here, right? I would need to hard code in something like this that goes around, right? Another transition that comes around and can send here. Or if I didn't do that, I can add a global transition like this, right? So it's like if I wanted this to also have a global transition like that. So this now is a way of saying that instead of having to get to this state 3 via state 2, instead of having to go finished, finished, now I'm at state 3, instead this collision enter 2D could be fired off from somewhere else in the world, and I could say goes directly from state 1 to this collision enter 2D transition to state 3. So effectively bypassing this state 2, right? So that's what's interesting about these different types of transitions. So with this collision enter 2D, just like the finish transition I showed you earlier, there is some logic that's hard-coded into Playmaker with this. So with this one, the collision enter 2D, this actually gets fired off if the game object that this logic lives on, which is our vector bullet here, has a rigid body and a collider on it, and that there is a collision detected on it, and specifically a collision enter type of detection, right? Because if you see, I come over here to global transitions, system events. There's all sorts of special logic here for collisions. So you can do collision enter 2D, exit, stay, and there's also similarly controller, collider, hit. Lots of other bespoke events here. And they don't have to be global transitions. You can also have them coming from a normal transition like this. If I just add normal, local transition, we have them accessible over here. So I could do something like this as well, right? Just as easily, you can have something that look like this, okay? Like that, and this works the same way. But yeah, I like having it like this right now because we just remind ourselves that this can happen at any point. So collision enter 2D, we want this to deal damage, right? So it's like, or, you know, hit object, whatever it is. Okay, so what we're gonna do is get collision 2D info. We're gonna put that in here. And what we want to get is the game object that this hit. So we can say that the game object to hit is object hit. Okay, so it's just going to tell us, hey, what did this collide with? And then what we want to do is send whatever we hit an event. So we can send it an event. First of all, we want to say that the target is, specify the game object as our object that we just hit. And the event that we want to send is a new global event. It has to be a global event. And we'll call this hit by bullet. Okay. And by the way, the first time you make a global event, Playmaker is going to tell you that it made a file that holds all of your globals in here. So this little pop-up will happen the first time, but every time you make one after that, this will not pop up. So you could just hit OK. All right. And now I can select my hit by bullet event. So this hit by bullet event is going to be sent to the thing that we just hit. And when that's done, we can add a finish transition to this and go back up here to destroy self. So it'll deal that damage, but then the bullet will actually just go away. Okay, that's why we only have this one destroy self state. So there could be two different ways that get sent to the same thing. Okay, and our lifetime, let's go to our variables here and change this lifetime 1.5 seconds. Okay, so just so our bullets will last 1.5 seconds. And let's just test how that works right now. Okay, so we fire one and then it disappears. Fires and then it disappears. And you can see right now it's disappearing. That's great. But our bullets are still hitting us. So just a quick test. Let's see what happens if you just add in, right? If I come over here and add an FSM to this really quick. And we'll call this let's just call this our damage FSM, and we'll hit edit. And in here, we're gonna right click, add a global transition, custom events, and then we have our hit by bullet transition that we just added. And in here, we'll just put destroy self. Okay, so this is just kind of this is a test. You know, maybe you can keep this in, but let's just see how our bullets react when they hit us. Okay, so we could fly around, we could shoot, and then and now the tension kind of builds because let's see, all right, and then boom, that bullet hit us and we disappeared, right? So we essentially want to apply that same logic to other things now. I'm gonna go ahead and just in our damage right now, I'm just going to get rid of that for now. We will have damage logic in here, but that's not going to be, it'll be a little different. Just wanted to show you that as a test. Okay.